Thank you, everyone. Okay. Don't worry, this is the correct PowerPoint. The images on screen are of works by Gian Lorenzo Bernini, one of the most sublime artists of the Western canon. What you might not know is that when he discovered that his married mistress, Costanza Piccolomini Bonarelli, was having an affair with his brother, he had his servant slash her face, leaving her mutilated. Bernini was a transcendent artist and a true shit of a human being. He has not, however, been cancelled, though I wonder sometimes how his reputation would have fared had his mistress been a famous figure. For instance, an exhibition on Agostino Tassi would be unthinkable now, since he's become best known not as an artist, but as the rapist of Artemisia Gentileschi. Caravaggio, of course, famously committed manslaughter following a heated argument, but given that murder is cool, the crime has only burnished his reputation as a volatile genius, all of which should give us pause when we joke about the supposedly archaic expression, a fate worse than death, which clearly still resonates, but that's for another discussion. For a number of years, here we are. Sorry, for a number of years, Paul Gauguin was considered persona non grata, accused of spreading syphilis to underage girls in French Polynesia. Exhibitions of his works were greeted with accusations of encouraging pedophilia, yet as Sue Prideaux has written in her highly acclaimed 2025 biography, DNA analysis of Gauguin's teeth prove he did not have syphilis. In addition, Gauguin's youngest known lover was 15 when they met, an age which makes us deeply uncomfortable now. Yet not only was it common practice in Polynesia at the time, but the age of consent in those years in Italy was 12, in France 13, and in certain states in the United States it was 10. I bring all of this up in order to ask the question, who decides who gets canceled and why? As far as I'm aware, it's not verboten to show films produced by Harvey Weinstein, perhaps because doing so would mean shelving some of the best films made by Hollywood's current elite. This may seem like a digression, but it would appear that Kevin Spacey is currently being rehabilitated, receiving an award last month, quote, in recognition of his remarkable contributions to global cinema and his influence on storytelling. He also got an award here in Italy yesterday, and thank you to the Times of England, who was able to do a headline that managed to both support a sex abuser and be Islamophobic at the same time. Kudos to Rupert Murdoch. Anyone with links to the New York theater world in the 1980s can tell you that we all heard that he was abusing young men, just as we all knew Weinstein was abusing women, though Spacey has never been convicted, and perhaps it's considered less insidious if the sexual abuse is between two men rather than a man and a woman. But I have strayed from my topic. Let me have a show of hands. Who here believes that a director is the sole auteur of a film? I ask because when we decide that the films of Bernardo Bertolucci are off the table, we're also canceling Vittorio Storaro, Stefania Sandrelli, Gatto Barbieri, Franco Arcaldi, Dominique Sanda, Joan Chen, and countless others, including Maria Schneider. Is this what we mean to do? A prominent Italian director is currently shooting a documentary on Bertolucci, yet he's been unable to get any American director, not one, to speak on camera about Bertolucci for fear they'll be branded apologists for the Last Tango in Paris scene. Are we afraid of negative publicity, or are we just too lazy to look at complex issues and find ways of discussing them in public? In 2014, I moderated a cinema chat with Mia Farrow at the Locarno Film Festival. We met the day before, and in order to make her feel comfortable with me, I told her I would shut down any questions from the audience about Woody Allen. She thanked me profusely and then said, "I'm happy to talk about the films I made with Woody Allen. I just don't want to talk about Woody Allen." Exactly. Farah knows better than most the difficulties involved for actors whose greatest roles were with directors now considered off the table, Roman Polanski and Woody Allen. Honoring Polanski with a César, especially for a mediocre movie, smacks of the worst kind of rigid, male-dominated, antiquated auteurism, but we should be acknowledging the great films he made. To do so means opening ourselves up to defending our decisions and explaining them coherently to an audience. So let me ask again, is the director really the sole creative agent on a film? Rather than encouraging profound reflection on this and the other issues I'm presenting, We've allowed ourselves to be held hostage by shallow binary thinking. Hold on to this thought, as I'll be getting back to it shortly. Screening travelogues made by Western cameramen in areas of what we now usefully call the global South opens us up to criticism because we're perceived as perpetuating the colonial gaze. Are we therefore meant to lock these films away, making them available only to researchers focusing on colonialism and its aftermath? Instead, shouldn't we be finding ways to connect these films with communities and the places they were made? The films that survived from the early silent era were almost exclusively made by cameramen from the global North. So what are our options? Denying people in Hanoi or Damascus or Gaza or the Amazon the possibility of getting a glimpse of the world of their great-grandparents? Aren't we allowing ourselves to be controlled by our sense of culpability for the toxic imperialism of our past, thereby fleeing from our responsibility? When I made the short video for the FIAF Winter School earlier this year on the subject of programming difficult films, I said that guilt was a useless emotion. I misspoke. Guilt is not useless, guilt is pernicious. Guilt is what people and governments hide behind, thinking it will protect their asses. Guilt is the excuse for the German government's continued support of Israel's genocide in Gaza. Guilt has been so successfully weaponized by Zionism that over the past 77 years, no Western government has held them accountable for the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people. Guilt without a considered understanding of cause and effect. Guilt without the ability to understand how the past differs from today. Guilt without a blueprint that brings in historically disenfranchised communities becomes toxic. Shouldn't we be trying to break that cycle rather than allow ourselves to be trapped as well in that guilt? Running away from the issue out of the fear that filmgoers might be triggered by images potentially seen as exoticizing and orientalizing helps no one. It's a betrayal of history and an acknowledgement that we have failed. So what do? We encourage audiences to find alternative ways to look at the images. It used to be that so-called women's pictures from the 1930s and 40s were decried for the ways they punished women for any perceived disruption of the patriarchy. But now new school feminists have helped us gain tremendous pleasure from these films by underlining that our sympathies lie entirely with these disruptive women. When Ruth Chatterton's character in Female brings every handsome man on her staff into her bed, we say, "You go, girl." Fully aware that at the end of the movie, when George Brent's character paints a dull picture of married life with 9 kids, we know that it's not gonna happen. Rather than expressing frustration at how she's forced into a bourgeois box in the final minutes, we celebrate her uninhibited libido. This clip, from Pate's The Fountains of Constantinople is from 1925. Syrup cellars were a common sight in the Ottoman Empire and a frequent subject for Orientalist paintings and photography. So yes, some may view these images as the exoticization of the East, shot by a Western cameraman. Yet aren't all of our sympathies with this man? Do we, from our vantage point today, see him as the other or as an enormously charismatic figure? This clip is from Amazonas, Maioria do Mundo by Silvino dos Santos Silva from 1918, identified in the Prague archive and shown in Pordenone in 2023. Santos Silva's connection with an industrialist known for his exploitation of indigenous peoples needs to be discussed in conjunction with any screening of the film. But these images of Witoto girls are the earliest known. Look at the joy on their faces, which you'll see in a minute. Do we view them now with a sense of superiority, or do we see a common humanity? Why are we afraid to show such images to a general public when it doesn't take so much work to offer context, acknowledging certain problematic elements while providing guidance to how we can view these films today? Music can be an ideal way to take ownership of potentially problematic images. In 2022, we screened Nanook of the North, a film dogged by accusations of colonial exploitation of indigenous peoples. However, Gabrielle Thibodeau wrote an extraordinary score that gives prominence to 2 Inuit throat singers. In addition, the catalog note was written by Francesca Ruffini, who lived in the same community as the people in the film, met with their descendants, and uncovered a far more collaborative relationship between Flaherty and Nanook than has generally been acknowledged. In 2018, Sex, Race et Colonie was published in France, exploring how the West has racialized and sexualized the other. The book set off a storm of protest from people who felt many of the disturbing images reproduced should not be seen, arguing it was better to suppress them than risk giving fodder to racists or potentially upsetting people from former colonized nations who might experience the images as violation. Yet hiding these things away merely lets them fester in the dark while allowing people to minimize or forget their toxicity. The reason why so many Italians don't think the fascist-era racial laws were so bad is because their extent has been deliberately downplayed, a situation that only helps the far right to frolic in a dangerously seductive nostalgia for the Mussolini era. I've yet to understand how hiding our past makes us more sensitive people. Equally, apologizing for our past without actually doing anything is just another rickety crutch, like guilt. For many people, myself included, last year's highlight at Le Giornate del Cinema Muto was a screening of Saxophone Susie, a deliriously fun German comedy from 1928, directed by Karel Lamach and restored by the DFF and Lou Burkart. Thank you, Lou. After the Pordenone screening, the film has been traveling to many other venues and was supposed to be in Minneapolis about a month ago. The organizers lined up the musicians. Everything was fine until one of the musicians Googled the film and found this French release poster on Wikipedia. Convinced the film must be racist solely because this particular poster has black caricatures, the musicians pulled out and the screening was canceled, despite the organizers reassuring them that there was no racist element in the film. It should surprise no one that the musicians were not black, and there are no black performers or blackface in the film at all. In 2021, the Cinémathèques di Milano contacted me to say they discovered a lost 1927 Warner Brothers comedy set during the First World War called Ham and Eggs at the Front. When I looked at it up, my heart sank. It appeared to be all in blackface. Yet it was one of Myrna Loy's first important roles, so I went to my bookshelves, pulled out her autobiography and read of her retrospective shame. Quote, "How could I ever put on blackface? When I think of it now, it horrifies me," unquote. Then I watched the film. The racism isn't just in the blackface, but in countless other noxious stereotyped behaviors, especially recognizable to Americans. But not only do the black-faced soldiers win the battle, most of the extras are actually African American. Researching what African American newspapers had to say, I discovered that most reports were positive. I decided we needed to screen the film, but to give it the proper context, I asked the scholar Nadia Field to write the catalog note, which she did brilliantly. This does not mean, of course, that I'll indiscriminately show films just to point out the racism of the past. I didn't program Topsy and Ava in a William Cameron Menzies series because the film is almost irredeemably awful. The same can't be said for the 1936 Fred Astaire film Swing Time, though it's become one of the most difficult musicals to screen thanks to a dance number in which Astaire, in blackface, pays homage to the great performer Bill Bojangles Robinson. Dance historians include the number among Astaire's very best, and yet of course we recoil at the blackface. Looking at African American newspapers of the time, however, once again we find praise. My apologies for the poor quality of the image on the left, which comes from the Atlanta Daily World and shows Robinson appreciatively looking at a photo of Astaire and expressing his congratulations for the tribute paid to him. Of course, we need to be careful when screening Springtime to a general public, but surely making it a subject of discussion rather than hiding it away is part of our mission as film programmers. I appreciate there's a big difference between a Pordenone audience and the general public. I'm enormously privileged to be able to program for an audience of archivists and scholars who generally understand that holding the past up to the same social and ethical standards we have today creates a minefield of problems. In the evergreen words of the novelist L.P. Hartley, the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. Emphasizing these words isn't meant to make us feel smug in our non-existent postmodern superiority. Rather, Hartley's message is that we find ourselves in danger when we presume we can use identical analytical tools for both past and present. Noel Malcolm, in his groundbreaking study of male-male sexual relations between 1400 and 1750, states the case clearly. A central part of our role as historians is to keep questioning, testing, and modifying those prior assumptions as we gradually learn more about the ways in which the past differs from the present. That process cannot benefit from being subordinated to present-day social or political requirements, however potentially beneficial those requirements might seem to be in contemporary terms. I'm nearly done. Last year, a new Pordenone audience member wrote saying we should have a therapist in the theater because so many images she saw were triggering. My first thought was, what happens when she looks at a newspaper headline? Yet clearly she's not alone, given how often that word trigger is used now. What this should tell us, however, is not that we need to tread ever more carefully in order not to offend someone's sensibilities. Instead, we need to be more actively engaged in countering this simplistic notion which demands we hide what's uncomfortable. Because it seems to me that we've been losing the conversation. I'm not naive. I know full well that many institutions are held hostage by marketing departments, putting pressure on directors, all of whom are terrified of negative tweets, painting us as insensitive promoters of trauma. We need to find ways to come together and counter this shallow, knee-jerk response to images from the past. We need to be encouraging dialogue and analysis, recognizing the disturbing elements of many great films, and cogently explaining that bringing them out into the light is the best way of breaking cycles of toxicity. So please, let's not hide behind the tired Henri Langlois notion of a pure cinema. Cinema is not pure. To paraphrase Tallulah Bankhead, cinema is pure as the driven slush. That doesn't mean we can't be entertained. It doesn't mean we can't occasionally use cinema as an escape. But as the keepers of cinema heritage, we fail our audiences when we allow ourselves to be intimidated by shallow, simplistic thinking. Isn't that one of the reasons why the world is in such a mess right now? For too long, we as a society have sat on our hands as loud and noxious figures in the public eye take control and dumb down the narrative, packaging concepts in crude black and white terms. So in our little world of cinema, one that reflects the full variety of the human experience, let's instead encourage engagement, not escape. Let's really challenge toxicity. Let's speak up. And at the risk of seeming dramatic, silence equals death. Thank you.